Welcome to the HC Insider Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. Today we're going to talk about hydrogen. Historically, hydrogen has just been an industrial gas feedstock and a key polluter. However, now it's seen as a key tool to the route to decarbonisation, improving air quality, and tackling climate change. And hydrogen has something for everyone. For oil and gas producers, it's a key source of revenue for their production. It can use existing infrastructure, and even for the power generation industry, where it can solve intermittency in renewables production, and also could be a key consumer of renewables energy to create green hydrogen. Joining us to discuss is Traynor. JJ is a founder and principal of HydrogenOne, an investment house focused on the sector, and has 30 years in the energy sector and financial markets, working for such operating companies as BP and Shell, and also working for investment bank Deutsche. JJ, thanks for joining us.
Paul, thanks for the opportunity. Good to speak to you today.
So I guess before we talk about the future of hydrogen, can we talk a little bit about the past? What is the hydrogen market right now, and what has it been over the last 100 years, and some of its uses? Can you give us the background?
Yeah, no, delighted. I mean, hydrogen was actually discovered in the 1760s by British scientist Cavendish. And about 100 years before him, Boyle actually identified it, but didn't really realise what he'd found. So this stuff goes back a long way. Today, it's widely used in high temperature industrial processes like chemicals manufacturing, steel, oil refining, and it's used as a coolant in the power sector. It's made by industrial gas companies, names like Linde and Air Products. It's a market of about 70 million tons per annum of hydrogen. It's growing, but not growing spectacularly, 2.5% a year or so. About 40% of the hydrogen that's made is consumed in Asia Pacific, and over 95% of it is made by reforming fossil fuels, so coal or oil or natural gas, and all of that's known as grey hydrogen. And it costs about $1 to $2 per kilo to make. So that is the hydrogen market today.
So at the moment, I mean, it's fair to say that it is part of the problem, rather than in any way a part of the solution.
Yes. Hydrogen manufacturing currently emits about 830 million tons a year of CO2. And I think we both have British accents. That's roughly 2 times the annual emissions of all of the UK are emitted by the hydrogen manufacturing industry. So it is a pretty substantial emitter.
And that's because it is essentially derived from crude oil and natural gas, or from the oil industry.
Correct. You crack hydrocarbons, coal, oil, or natural gas, take out the hydrogen and release the rest into the atmosphere.
So how long has this idea been about, I assume, since also the 1760s, that you could essentially burn hydrogen and your byproducts would be water? It would be a non-polluting fuel if you could get at it.
I think a couple of things have really changed that have pushed hydrogen right up the list of things to do as use as a fuel rather than purely as an industrial feedstock. And Paul, I'd identify three things really that are pushing this thing forward. So the aftermath of the Paris Agreement, the COP21 agreement, and the pathways that are being set by many governments around the world to net zero, and the realization, obviously, that hydrogen can play a big part in that, in displacement of fossil fuels. Secondly, the air quality agenda. So the reality that fossil fuels in things like cars and trucks and buses and power plants are actually not good for human health. Particularly in the COVID world, the human health agenda is right up on the list of things for people to think about. And hydrogen has a big role to play in all of that. And then I think thirdly, innovation. We're moving into a world here of lower and lower cost electricity from renewable sources, so wind and solar. And as that electricity price comes down, there's a whole other way of making hydrogen. So rather than cracking fossil fuels, you can do electrolysis and release hydrogen and oxygen from water using electricity. So it's the political climate, it's the human health environment, and the innovation, which I think altogether are putting hydrogen right back on the map as an energy source. Forecasters like investment banks, Barclays, for example, or industry bodies like the IEA see an 8 times increase in hydrogen demand out to 2050. And companies like BP, who make projections as to the energy mix in the future, think that up to 10% of energy supply could actually be coming from hydrogen now by 2050. So quite some change out there. And I think it's those multiple factors that are driving the hydrogen wave that we're seeing today.
How long has hydrogen been in the zeitgeist? It just seems over the last 2 years or so, or even the last, really this year, that it's become so dominant and prevalent in media, in the news, in the discussion around decarbonization. Is this something that's just really come to the fore recently, or has this been in the energy companies been focused on hydrogen for quite some time?
Look, I think there's multiple factors. The Paris Agreement in 2015, I think, was a key moment in the energy world. Governments came away from that COP21 meeting, not with exact top-down targets, but with an agreement to set their own frameworks, their own targets to get to net zero. And, to uptake on that at different rates in different parts of the world, at a country level, at a state level. And companies reacted to that as well. They could see that there's a change coming here, and it's a societal change. And where we are today, over 66 countries actually have net zero targets in place now for 2050. And 18 governments so far have set regional hydrogen strategies as part of those net zero targets. So there's a big change on the political side, and then at an industrial level. I mean, one barometer of industry enthusiasm for this is a group called the Hydrogen Council, which is a CEO forum. Guess what? Discusses hydrogen. And there are now over 90 members of the Hydrogen Council, CEOs from industrial companies, from fossil fuel companies, and a whole spectrum of supply chain companies. So there's a real shift, I think, and I would just put my finger on COP21 and the aftermath of that as the real change. Hydrogen isn't new. I mean, I think you put your finger on it. The big oil companies, Shell, for example, have been involved in hydrogen for many years, but not at any material scale, more at an R&D type scale. But I think things are really changing.
If I were to really break it down, I think it's so crucial we get this right. On the production side, it really matters how and from where it's produced. And that's where technology has really unlocked this industry to some extent. On the consumption side, it's kind of a super fuel. It's got a variety of different applications, whether that's as a direct fuel for transportation or whether it's in generation. I just want to really sort of dig into this area.
Yeah, let me go through a couple of things. There's how it's produced and all the different aspects there, and then the drivers as to why there is this strong demand pull for hydrogen as a commodity, which is the climate change agenda. There's the air quality agenda. So let me go through some of those aspects in a bit more detail. Firstly, on the production side, I would just identify 4 different types of hydrogen. There's a lot of jargon in this area, but there are really basically 4 types, and they're color-coded: grey, blue, green, and turquoise. Grey, I think we've touched on. That's taking fossil fuels, extracting the hydrogen, and then releasing the rest into the atmosphere. So greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's what's widely used today to make hydrogen, using a process called steam methane reforming. Blue hydrogen uses steam methane reforming, so it takes natural gas, but instead of releasing the greenhouse gas byproduct, that greenhouse gas is captured and it's stored geologically in depleted oil and gas reservoirs or in salt caverns. So that's blue hydrogen. Green hydrogen, very different. This uses renewable electricity, so from wind and solar, and using an electrolysis process makes hydrogen with a byproduct oxygen. In other words, no GHG emission, hence the name green hydrogen. And then turquoise hydrogen, which I think is a bit further in the future, actually, is a pyrolysis process whereby natural gas is converted into hydrogen. And the byproduct, rather than being a greenhouse gas, is actually solid carbon, which can be stored or used for other manufacturing processes. So those are the four main types. There are plenty of variations out there. And one of the emerging ones, which I think is very interesting, is steam methane reforming of renewable natural gas. So natural gas that's derived from fermentation of wood chips and waste products. I think that's pretty small scale, but that is a technology to keep an eye on. So those are the major sources of hydrogen. In terms of the demand pull and where does this stuff go? Decarbonization is one, and air quality is another, and there's some interlinkages here, Paul. Decarbonization, basically use of hydrogen for transport fuel, for power generation, as an industrial feedstock, and for heating. And those processes are either using fuel cells, so fuel cells which take in hydrogen and make electricity, and water as a byproduct, or burning the hydrogen in turbines in large-scale power plants. So you can see the fossil fuels being displaced by hydrogen in those parts of the energy system. One spin out of that is the ability of hydrogen to act as a system buffer. So as you know, wind and solar, which can be used to make green hydrogen, wind and solar are intermittent. The sun shines, the sun doesn't shine, the wind blows, the wind doesn't blow. By converting that electricity, or converting that renewable electricity into hydrogen, the hydrogen can then be stored either in the existing natural gas pipeline networks, so that's called power to gas. It could be stored geologically in salt caverns and so forth, or it can be converted into ammonia, which is a more readily transportable liquid than liquefied hydrogen. So there's this storage and system buffering aspect to the hydrogen economy, as well as its use as a fuel.
Which is, again, where one of the fascinating things about this is that, unlike, say, for example, batteries, hydrogen can lean into existing infrastructure as well. This is kind of the energy company's ideal solution in some ways, and I guess we'll come on to that. Just before we do that, and I know I'm asking quite prosaic questions, but I think it's really important to kind of get some of this stuff down. When it comes to transportation, what form is the hydrogen going to be delivered to? Cars, trucks, whatever it might be.
Compressed gas. So again, this is not a technology step out. So CNG is widely used. So compressed natural gas is widely used in trucks around the world. LPG, liquefied petroleum gases, and so what you have is a pressurized cylinder in your car. Or your truck, and hydrogen is pressurized into that cylinder. So very, 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 very established technologies.
So you mentioned the fuel cell there. How long has that been around, and kind of what prevalence are we talking?
Well, look, fuel cells have been around since the 1960s. Actually, NASA used hydrogen fuel cells on the Gemini program, believe it or not. Again, being a Houston-based person, you'll resonate with that very well, I think, Paul. And then General Motors built the first fuel cell vehicle in the mid 1960s. It was a minivan that looked a bit like the Mystery Machine, if you're a Scooby-Doo fan. So this technology has been around a long time. Again, I might go back to the air quality point and what a strong pull that is on demand for cleaner vehicles in urban environments. Fuel cells sales have increased 5 times since 2014. But even so, there are still less than 500,000 fuel cell vehicles on the roads today. If you look at projections made by, not by us, but made by third parties, 10 million fuel cell vehicles before 2030. And these will be trucks, vans, and cars, and actually the forklift market. That 10 million figure is small in the totality of the transport fleet, but as an investor, the growth rate that comes from that is obviously very, very attractive.
And that would be a relatively simple step, as you say, to kind of start decarbonizing the transport fleet. And in a minute, if you can map out for us kind of the timelines here, but you've got this nirvana-like state of when you can actually produce all the hydrogen you need through renewable power sources and convert it, either as a storage for the renewable power source itself, replacing batteries to tackle that intermittency, or, that hydrogen also just goes into the grid, the pipeline system, and it uses fuels and generation elsewhere. Can we talk about timelines here? Because as I understand it, the transportation piece is probably much closer to the future than that nirvana-like state of all of our electrolysis producing hydrogen and that being the ultimate energy currency.
Yeah, look, I think the air quality issue is a very, very important demand pull on hydrogen now. And, there's some slightly grim observations here, Paul. So ambient air quality is responsible, or poor ambient air quality is responsible for over 4 million premature deaths per year. So these are World Health Organization statistics. About a third of all deaths from lung disease, so specifically lung cancer, and about a quarter of all deaths from stroke actually come from poor ambient air quality. And this, of course, is trucks, it's cars, it's power plants in the urban environment. Particularly a problem in Asia, especially India and China. But not only in Asia. If you travel across Europe and try and drive in London these days, there's an ultra low emission zone. And there's a low emission zone around the ultra low emission zone. This is all about reducing diesel in London city centre, because the city actually has fallen below the EU air quality standards. Paul, I think you're in Houston, if I'm correct. I don't want to alarm you, but one of the metrics for ambient air quality is a thing called PM 2.5, and that's particulate matter that measures below 2.5 micrograms. These particles go into your lungs, they get into your bloodstream, and they cause a wide variety of health effects directly linked to heart and lung disease and early death. You may be alarmed to know that Houston, in 2019, Houston actually exceeded its PM 2.5 recommendations under the WHO definitions in 3 of the 12 months of 2019, so November, December, and March. And actually, a group called the Environmental Defense Fund and the Harvard School of Public Health estimated that in 2015 in Houston, there were 5,000 premature deaths as a result of poor air quality. So I don't want to put you off your afternoon tea, but those are some quite stark observations.
I've mentioned it a couple of times. I think one of the fascinating things of COVID was a stark demonstration for those couple of months in or couple of March and April globally, when we saw a world without the day-to-day impact of transportation, and it was remarkable how quickly it changed. So I think perhaps we've had a little bit of a glimpse into what the world could be like, and hydrogen seems like that it's kind of a great fit for the existing infrastructure and for tackling that particular problem of air quality, which of course itself is actually married to and very closely linked with CO2 emissions and climate change.
Well, I think that's right. And look, battery electric will work, or does work very well for light vehicles over short distances. Battery electric is much less effective for heavier vehicles, and heavier vehicles particularly over long distances. And so hydrogen in trucks and buses, and I think ultimately in trains, alongside battery electric in cars, is the way to address that air quality issue in these urban environments. And coming to your question of the timescales, we at HydrogenOne, we think this is a very powerful pull on hydrogen demand now. And kind of irrespective of the source of the hydrogen. So this is about cleanup of city centres, and the hydrogen that's used for that can be sourced from a variety of the methods that I talked about. Over the period 2020 to 2025, green and blue hydrogen is going to move out of the pilot stage and into full deployment. We see a number of projects like in both of those categories on the table in Europe, in the Middle East, and in North America. Transport, so trucks, forklifts, and cars are out of the pilot stage and are seeing deployment around the world. You can buy a Toyota fuel cell truck, you can buy a Hyundai fuel cell truck. A little bit further out in the future, flight using hydrogen, so turboprop into fuel cells. We would see that as a 2025 to 2030 commercialization, and then potentially jet beyond 2030. On power generation, there are some substantial power plants under construction that use hydrogen in their turbines in the Netherlands, in Japan, in the United States. So again, moving out of the pilot phase very quickly there, and building heat, again, coming down the tracks very quickly. So I think over the next decade, perhaps shorter, you're going to see quite a broad deployment of hydrogen technologies into the energy system.
And I assume for the most part, that is going to be driven by blue hydrogen or turquoise. But this, I guess where you're converting existing hydrocarbon production, sequestrating the carbon piece, and that's the source? Or do you see green hydrogen being which hydrogen is going to dominate the market in that timescale?
I think it depends where you are around the world. I mean, there are some substantial industrial sites that have been put together for the oil and gas industry. So offshore fields, pipelines, refinery sites, petrochemical plants. Those can be modified and reinvested to produce blue hydrogen, particularly where they're closely affiliated with depleted reservoirs. Those sites can also be used for electrolysis to manufacture green hydrogen, but I think primarily blue at this stage. On a cost basis, and in the end, energy is very customer led. It's very, very price sensitive. The reality is that grey hydrogen, so the stuff we use now, $1 to $2 per kilo. If you add in carbon capture and storage and turn that into blue hydrogen, so that turns the $1 to $2 cost to a $2 to $3 cost, so kind of in the same range. And green hydrogen is structurally more expensive today, so think $6 per kilo, maybe a touch higher. So we do think that green hydrogen prices are going to fall. Green hydrogen costs are going to fall over time as that industry scales up. But in the meantime, look, blue hydrogen on a price and an availability basis seems to be a good scaled way to go here.
It's kind of interesting because it strikes me that you've had, roughly speaking, two camps when we talk about sort of the energy future. And it's those that are electron focused. It's going to be really an electron only world. And this hydrogen view is different to that. What does hydrogen have benefits wise over just really pushing on electrons, batteries, all the rest of it?
So let me give you a slightly broader answer to that question. And we think of these things as not as an either or, but an as well. Timescales are often very underestimated in the energy industry. So energy systems take a long time to change. And this is because of incumbent technologies and incumbent infrastructure and just the time it can take to mature technologies. So if you look at the wind industry as an example, the first commercial wind farm was actually in 1975. It was built in 1975 in the US. But wind as a way of generating electricity had actually been around since the 1900s in Denmark. Today, if you take wind and solar together, and despite all of the investments and all of the growth that you've seen in wind and solar, it's actually together less than 5% of global energy supply. And those are the kinds of timescales and types of scaling that you see in the energy industry. It's the growth rate that makes it attractive for investors. Obviously, getting to 5% energy supply in wind and solar is a near doubling, more like a 3x in the last 10 years. But in terms of the energy mix, it's still a very small part of the story. Going forward, you're going to need all of these energy sources to match off energy demand as we move into a net zero world. I think it's important to bear in mind that energy demand actually grows annually. It's very, very much linked to GDP. So you've got to meet rising demand, rising aspirations for people in the world for better quality of living, which of course goes hand in hand with access to cheap and reliable energy sources. And you've got to do it in a way that takes out CO2 out of the system. So I think hydrogen's part of the mix, and I gave you a kind of a 10% figure for the scale of hydrogen out to 2050. could be as low as 7%, could be as high as 15%, but 10% feels about right. And alongside that, you are going to need low emissions hydrocarbons. So you're going to need CCS to take the CO2 out of the hydrocarbon system. And you're going to need nuclear power and more wind and more solar. So I think there's a very broad front that's going to be needed here to decarbonize the energy system.
What's fascinating as well is if you look at the renewable power world, the IRR in that segment is pretty low compared to what the oil and gas industry are used to, right? You're talking making, up numbers here, but sort of a 6 to 9% return compared to a 25, 30% return. And hydrogen is much more congruent, much easier to transition to for an oil producer, right? It's pretty much the same infrastructure. It's just that carbon capture, as you mentioned, compared to trying to do that full shift into electrons. What do you think from a commercial standpoint, from a policy standpoint, will it take for hydrogen to match those predictions that you made, but also exceed them?
I think a lot of the ingredients are actually on the table today. And it's not a story that you need a dramatic shift in government policy or a dramatic shift in company strategy to get to where I think and where many people think the hydrogen industry is going to go. I mean, what you need is joined up government policy and industry planning. It's very collaborative. If you look at the big green hydrogen projects that are being discussed in Europe, for example, these are offshore and onshore projects, so offshore wind and onshore electrolyzers, with the permitting that goes with both of those. Different companies are doing the offshore and the onshore, and then perhaps the third company is the off-taker. So it's a very collaborative environment. To get things like that moving, you need a very coherent, joined-up set of government policies, and obviously the right fiscal structures and incentives in place to make it all happen. I think those ingredients are there. It's different in different parts of the world, but I would just highlight the European Union, Australia, parts of the United States, parts of Canada, obviously Japan, South Korea, China, where this is moving apace and moving along very, very nicely.
Just as an aside, does that mean that natural gas will, over time, as we go through this transition, be relatively worth more than oil because it's actually easier to convert into hydrogen? Is that a fair statement?
I would be a bit careful. Natural gas typically trades at a calorific discount to crude oil. And the reason for that is that crude oil is a more flexible fuel and more flexible feedstock. It's cheaper to transport it, and you can make more things out of it than you can out of natural gas. The demand barrel for crude oil is changing here. So, what was a gasoline economy and an aviation fuel economy probably becomes more of a petrochemical feedstock economy for the oil guys over time. But I would be a little bit reluctant to say that natural gas would become a premium fuel over crude because of its translatability into hydrogen, if nothing else, because there's just so much natural gas out there, and that's what tends to set the price, particularly in your part of the world. Another way to look at it is the ability of gas-rich regions, natural gas-rich regions, and renewable energy-rich regions to actually convert that energy and that natural gas into ammonia or hydrogen and actually export it. And I think governments in the Middle East and some Asia Pacific countries are realizing that they've actually got a new natural resource that they can continue to export, beyond the market that they can see for their hydrocarbon products.
So you've got this, definitely we see policies globally continuing to support hydrogen. From a commercial standpoint, it's got those multiple uses and production and existing infrastructure. How big is hydrogen as a conversation at the C-suite of the world's energy producers right now?
I think I wouldn't for a moment pretend to be in the C-suite of a major energy producer. Many of those, having said that, many of those large oil and gas companies are under tremendous pressure from their shareholders, from their boards, around the low profitability of today's business mix. So low oil prices in this COVID world, low natural gas prices, and we've seen many companies coming under pressure from credit rating agencies on the dividends, on the capital spending programs, on the cost structures. And so I think that those rather classical financial framework discussions are probably what's dominating those C-suite discussions. At the same time, different in different companies around the world, but there is a general trend towards cleaning up the portfolios of the major oil and gas companies and implementing plans for energy transition. It may be too simplistic, but it does appear that the European-based large oil and gas companies are moving more quickly on this one than the North America-based oil and gas companies. It's not mutually exclusive, but there is that observation. And in that mix, the ones that are moving more quickly to decarbonize are typically selling down their more carbon-intensive oil positions, investing more in growth natural gas, and in the medium term, investing more in renewables. And in that renewables space, hydrogen is very much part of the thinking. So if you look at the portfolio plans of companies like Equinor, like Shell, like BP, you see hydrogen flashing quite brightly on the list of things to do.
Yeah, whether it's tied to transportation or actually, as you say, electron generation.
And look, I think a lot of what they're focusing on, and again, I'm not in those C-suites, but it seems to me it's about extending the lives of their current asset bases. So how do I reconfigure my refinery site? How do I extend the life of my offshore infrastructure? Is there a hydrogen angle to play in there? And so that's where blue hydrogen obviously comes into its full.
A key bit here is going to be how the capital markets support the industry at a time when capital markets, whether it's private equity or whomever, are pulling away from traditional, conventional hydrocarbon businesses. You're founding an investment house solely focused on this. What is the role of private equity, of investment houses of capital to support the market? And why actually is it, why have you created HydrogenOne? Why is it an attractive space?
Well, look, no, thanks for the question, Paul. We myself and a gentleman called Richard Hulf founded HydrogenOne in the middle of 2020. And what we've identified is that even though there is this tremendous growth opportunity in hydrogen and a lot of interesting things happening, it's actually not easy to get invested in it if you're a player in the main market. So there are 15 or 20, globally listed pure hydrogen companies that make the fuel cells, they make the electrolyzers and the component parts. So there are some of those names, but frankly not very many. And then there's a lot happening on the private side. So innovation companies in electrolyzers and fuel cells, developer companies putting these projects together. But those private positions are quite hard to get access to if you're a main market investor. And so HydrogenOne is actually designed to give investors access to both, so to the listed companies and the private positions, and get that exposure to that growth play in a trend that's very much ESG compliant. So there's no fossil fuels emission in this portfolio, and this is very much a play on the energy transition. So we've put this thing together to give investors access to all that. We're trying to democratize hydrogen and give a broader investor base access to this very, very exciting trend.
Fabulous. Well, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show. It's a fascinating subject, I know, to us as a firm, but to the community at large. And I really appreciate you helping us understand it a bit better and giving us an outlook to the future.
All right, not at all. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, JJ. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show, please give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. To find out more about HC Insider and Human Capital, a search firm dedicated to the commodities sector, go to www.hcinsider.global, where you'll find more original content on the commodities sector and more details on our offering as a search firm and our locations around the world. Thanks again for listening.